optimization. In this nugget, we talk about optimization, where we want to make sure that our systems are running as efficiently as possible without the loss of any kind of capability or feature. We'll keep track of how our systems are performing by using Task Manager, and that gives us a real-time update of how things are operating, and we'll take a look at that, as well as virtual memory, which we can use in lieu of actual physical RAM to be able to give ourselves better functionality in terms of the number of applications we can run. And then we also take a look at temporary files, which are an important part of Windows and many applications, but you don't always want to keep those temporary files around. That's why they're temporary. And then we also will take a look at various services. Most of the services in current versions of Windows run just the way they're supposed to, but you can tweak certain things and perhaps if you want to disable certain services. And then we'll also take a look at startup. There are a couple of places where you might have applications that are configured to automatically launch when you just start up your computer and log on, and we'll see whether or not we need some of those kinds of applications. Well, where I live in Arizona, we have lots of outdoor activities that we can participate in, like hiking and so forth, but a few years ago I bought one of these Jeeps, and it was really quite a lot of fun. Eventually I had to give it up because I just couldn't put the whole family in this thing. It only seats 4, and I've got a family of 5. Plus their friends, and sometimes have to carry things and all. So it wasn't really practical for my family, but man, it was sure a bunch of fun, and my kids, as you can see there, really enjoyed it as well. One thing I had considered here, however, was putting a bunch of other stuff on here. I mean, you can see I put some chrome sidebars on there. That was just kind of for looks, I guess, and a little bit practical for going over rocks and things. And then the bigger tires and wheels. And I was thinking about doing some other stuff, too. Like on the front, putting a worn winch, just in case I get stuck somewhere, which certainly is a distinct possibility. And then also doing some things to the suspension here to give myself some better articulation, which means you can crawl over rocks a little bit better and at different kinds of angles. And all different kinds of things that I wanted to do this. And I took it to a shop, in fact, and they said, hey, you can put 20 grand into just the modifications for one of these things. And right now I'm thinking it's probably a good thing I did eventually get rid of that. But my kids are still mad at me for no longer having the Jeep. Well, with Windows, you can do a lot of different things to add on to it or to modify things so that it will perform better as well. It's not going to crawl over rocks for you, but it sure can improve the performance. Now, of course, before we go about optimizing our systems, we first need to know if we really need any optimization. I mean, it might be running just fine the way it is. The way you can check that out, one of the ways, is by using something called the Task Manager. And Task Manager gives you kind of a real-time view of what's going on. And again, that's Task Manager. We'll get a real-time view of what's happening. You can get to the Task Manager by a number of different ways. Number one, if you're in a domain, your computer is a member of a domain, then you can press Control-Alt-Delete, and there will be a Task Manager button that appears. I would show it to you, but when you press Control-Alt-Delete, it blocks all software from working, including my recording software, so it's not going to be able to show that to you in the foreground here. The other way is if you're a member of a work group like my current computer is right now, again, Control-Alt-Delete, and in this case, it does open up the Windows Task Manager for you this way. Or you can right-click here and choose Task Manager, or the way that I commonly do it is hold down Control and Shift and then press Escape, and bam, there it appears right here. Now, what this is useful for is identifying various applications that are running. For example, right now my whiteboard software that I use is called Corel's Painter Classic, and maybe it's giving me some kind of a problem. So what I can do is to right-click on this thing, and I could choose End Tasks. Now, of course, I don't really want to do that, and that's also a little bit of a crude way to end the application. It's better, if it's possible, to hit the little X in the upper right corner to close that application appropriately, or to use whatever the other method might be for appropriately closing that app. Another thing you might consider doing there is to right-click on this if you want to identify a little bit more about the process. For example, what the name of the executable is that's running this. You can right-click on it and then select Go to Process. And now I've identified the actual executable's name that appears, and I can see also how much memory it's using. And it's using 10 megabytes right now, which seems like a lot, but hey, in these days, that's not really a whole lot anymore. In the old days, that was quite a lot. Now, one thing I could do also is, again, if it's causing me a problem, I can still end the process from here, or there might be other little portions of the application or other little child applications that this has spawned or additional processes, and I might want to end the entire process tree. So that would mean it will end the Painter Classic program and any other applications that have been spawned or started as a result of this program running. So we could do it that way as well. Now, of course, if you do that, once again, it's a little bit more crude. You'll get an error message if I click End Process Tree, saying that it might cause some kind of instability or data loss. Do you want to continue, yes or no? And of course, right now I don't. Now, if I'm having an immediate performance problem with whatever application it is that I'm running, and I think that it's because it needs more processor time, and it's just not getting enough time from the processor, I can right-click here once again, choose Set Priority, and I can choose one of these other options right here. By default, almost all applications are configured to run normal, but if I need to give it a little bit more time, I can go above normal or high. You don't usually want to go to real time because that gives it way too much of a priority, and it could be that it will even crowd out system processes that are critical to the health of the operating system. So rarely do you want to go to real time unless you know, we're the last-ditch effort. So that's another thing to keep in mind with those items. Oh, and before I forget, there's also one other thing I needed to point out there, and that was this set affinity item. Now, affinities usually means something that you like. You know, I have an affinity for chocolate, or I have an affinity for things that start with the letter Q. I don't know, something like that. So I can click Set Affinity here, and likewise, I can tell this application which processors it likes the best. Now, by default right now, it's going to be configured to run on both of these. And with hyper-threaded processors, what it's going to show you is that it looks like it has two separate CPUs. They're actually on the same die, but it'll still show up as two. If I had two physical processors, then I could say, you know, I want this application to only run on one process or the other. And the reason why I might do that is because I want to be able to make sure that either A, it gets all the performance that it can get, or it's not that critical of an application. I want it to be a little bit more of a background kind of a thing. And then I'll only want it to run on a specific processor so that it doesn't hog time from other applications running on the second processor. So those are a couple of different ways that we can go there as well. Now, another thing you'll want to be aware of here is sometimes it'll look like an application is just chewing up CPU time. And what I can do here is to go to the CPU column and click that tab, or click that column, and then it will show me what's using the most CPU time. And system idle process is what we very often want to see using quite a lot of time. So what that tells me that it is that 98, 97% of the time, this processor is not really doing much of anything. And the only other thing we see going on here is my Painter Classic program, and it only requires, you know, maybe 3% CPU time. So I'm in a pretty good, healthy state right now in terms of overall processor utilization. You may also have noticed this thing down at the bottom that says show processes from all users. That's going to be especially useful if, for example, you have multiple users connected to a system through something like remote desktop or something of this nature. Or if you have multiple users that are logged on, especially like in the Home edition of Windows XP, where you can switch users. Yes, I've got my current desktop up here, but I might have Floyd who's also logged on. We just don't see his desktop right now. And then on the Performance tab, we see what's going on with the CPU usage and how much percentage it's getting. This is just a graphical representation of what I can already see here in terms of how much percentage of the utilization I'm getting. This is just the inverse of it. I'm using 5%, therefore my system idle time should be around 95%. And my page file usage as well. This is a big one to keep an eye on. Actually, both of these are, but what we have with this is you can get a thumbnail idea of whether or not your system needs a little bit of help in improving its performance. And this does not mean, by the way, that if it goes up to 10% or 30% or something that I need to be in a panic state. We're looking for sustained high percentages of CPU utilization. For example, I mean, if you just notice that if I launch Disk Keeper here, we'll see that the CPU spikes up a little bit while it's launching that app. And if I go ahead and start to do something else here as well, maybe I want to defragment this hard drive, we're going to see it get a little bit busier here as well as it starts to look at the hard drive and analyze everything that's going on. So we see it getting up a little bit higher there. So those are just some examples of different things that can go on to increase the CPU utilization. And once again, the page file usage down here identifies how much I'm using of the page file in absence of enough sufficient physical RAM. And we will be discussing that at a later time, but for the time being, let's go over here to networking as well. I find this to be very useful because it shows me on my local area connection what percentage of my total link speed I'm using. This might be useful if I'm trying to check my connection to my internet service provider. I'm downloading a large file, and it seems like it's going kind of slow. Well, I can go to networking here, and if I see that it's downloading 1% of a gigabit per second, that's actually pretty fast when you consider that. Or if you're like a lot of people that have maybe 100 megabit per second speed on your adapters, then 10% of that would be 10 megabits per second. 1% of that would be 1 megabit per second. That'd be pretty reasonable for something like a cable modem or a DSL connection. So I can get an idea there for how well that's performing. And then I have other users that I can see over here. If I have multiple users logged onto the same computer, I can disconnect them or log off. Disconnect meaning, of course, that if they're connected using a remote desktop connection or something like this, then I can terminate that session. We'll talk more about remote desktop connection in an upcoming nugget here shortly. So that gives you an overall view of the Windows Task Manager and what it's capable of doing. So as you can see with Task Manager, we get process management, performance data, and networking data all out of that. But again, it's a real-time thing. Now this goes beyond the scope of A+ exam objectives because it's not listed there, but if you want to keep a record of those things over a longer period of time, for example, how something's performing, even overnight, then you could go to Administrative Tools on the Start menu here, and then go down to Performance, and here you can create logs of all of your things like CPU utilization, how much the hard drive is working, and how backed up it is in terms of being able to perform all of its tasks. And you can do a lot of things with this to keep an archived data of the overall performance over a period of time, maybe even days or even weeks worth of data. Now, as much as I like that utility, let me tangent just briefly here to talk about Process Explorer, written by a guy named Mark Rustanovich, who used to have a website called sysinternals.com. His company has since been purchased by Microsoft, and so now Process Explorer is available for free download from Microsoft. So you can just search for it, and you'll be able to find it quite easily there. I've got a shortcut to it on my desktop here, and we can see that it does a lot of the same things that Task Manager does. It keeps track of my CPU utilization. What I like about this, though, is that it gives me a breakdown of individual things inside of different processes. So, for example, services.exe has a lot of different things within it that it also runs. So it's kind of sub-processes that could also run within this. And the hardware interrupts is very useful. For example, sometimes you'll get users that bring a computer into you, and they will say that, it seems to be performing really slow. So you look at Task Manager and you look over here on processes, and the idle time right here is pretty high. So you say, wow, why is this running so slow? But then you go to the Performance tab, and this is also showing like 90% utilization, or might be pegging at 100% utilization. Well, why is it that it's doing that? Very likely, you have a defective piece of hardware that is throwing out all kinds of hardware interrupts, which it needs to do in a normal operation to tell the CPU that it needs to access the CPU because it has a task that it needs to perform. But if it's throwing them out constantly because the device is defective or damaged, then it's going to spike your CPU utilization. And that's where you'll see some hardware interrupts right here using up way too much CPU utilization. And so that's a good indicator that you have a defective piece of hardware. I recently had that myself, in fact, and I was able to reveal that with this tool because I had a defective network card and it was sending out like 50-60% CPU utilization for just hardware interrupts. Now it didn't really say right here defective network card or something. I wish it would have been that easy. But I just started unplugging USB devices and other devices that I could do without and still boot the operating system. And eventually nothing showed any resolution to the problem until I took out my network card. And when I did that, these hardware interrupts went back down to almost nothing, like you see right here. And then I realized that it must be the network card that was causing the problem. Now, virtual memory can also be tracked, of course, in Windows Task Manager. This is known as the paging or swap file. It just kind of changes terms periodically, depending. Colloquially, we call it the swap file a lot of times, but Microsoft seems to prefer calling it the paging file. This is a portion out of your hard drive where it's carved out and it's dedicated towards the paging file, which is a substitute for memory, although your applications will see this as physical memory. Now, Windows will dictate whether or not it goes to that paging file, and applications have some say in this as well. But they'll dictate whether or not it goes into the paging file or into physical RAM, and I'll just put a RAM module up here. These aren't chiclets, these are memory chips on the RAM module. But maybe this, 1 gigabyte worth of physical RAM. Well, what if I'm running applications that currently require only 512 megabytes? Well, that'll be okay. It'll probably use a lot of the memory, or portion of this memory, but just as an operating system characteristic, it's still going to use some paging file. And in fact, let's take a look at my own task manager here to illustrate that. I've got a page file usage size of 243 megabytes, but I've got almost 780 megabytes worth of physical memory available. So why am I using this much paging file size if I'm barely even touching my memory really to speak of? Well, that's just the nature of Windows. Part of that is because it carves out a portion of that paging file in advance in case I'm going to need that in the near future. It will perform better if there is already some paging file space allocated as opposed to having to create it on the fly when I start up some big application. And then this becomes even more apparent as an advantage to use the paging file if I open up a lot more applications. I open up Outlook, Word, Photoshop, a complex game, a resource-intensive game, for example. Well, now maybe I've got a total of 1 gigabyte worth of additional programs that I've opened up. So I got a total of 1.5 gigabytes worth of RAM that I require. Now let's just illustrate that here, 1.5 gigabytes. Well, I've only got a gigabyte of RAM. So what's going to happen? It's going to say, you don't have enough RAM to run all this stuff, cowboy. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to throw you off to the paging file, and it'll trick your applications into thinking that they're running off of RAM when they're really being retrieved, sent and retrieved from the hard drive. And if we did not have a paging file, and you can remove a paging file, so you don't have one at all, but I don't recommend it. But if we didn't have a paging file then, and we needed this much memory, you'd get a message that would say something to the effect of insufficient memory. And then the paging file size is usually going to be about 1.5 times the amount of RAM. So if I have 1 gigabytes worth of RAM, multiplying that by 1.5 would be 1.5 gigabytes worth of paging file size. That'd be the default. So that, in other words, you could scope that out as 1,500 megabytes. Now, in my case, I changed the size of that because I wanted to optimize this for a couple of purposes. Number one, and this is an unusual case in my instance, but this application that I'm running that you see right here to do all this drawing on, it has a strange thing with paging file. If the paging file size is too big, then it will not be able to save files. Just kind of a quirky thing. It's a little bit of an older application. I still use it because it works, though. And so what I had to do is actually I had to shrink the size of my paging file. So if I right-click my computer and choose Properties and then go to the Advanced tab and the Performance here, go to the Settings for Performance, and then finally click on the Advanced tab here, we see that there's a virtual memory item down here, and I had to shrink the size of mine to 500 megabytes, which for me, honestly, is just fine because I'm not running that many applications here, and it's plenty of memory for me. So if I click on to change that, I can modify this in some other way if I want to. I also did this. I put it off to a different drive, and let me show you that as an optimization feature here. Put your paging file on a separate physical disk if possible. And the reason why I say that is because if we put these two partitions on the same physical disk, then putting my paging file over here would have some nominal effect. It might give me a slight performance increase, only because that paging file data over there might be on a dedicated partition for only paging files. Sometimes people have done that in the past. And as a result, if the paging file is the only thing there, then it can never get fragmented, and it'll always be contiguous space there. The other thing, however, would be to put these again on separate physical disks, and that's what I have going on here. That way the operating system can read and write to the system disk right here, while at the same time reading and writing information from my paging file over on this separate physical disk. And then another performance benefit to think of here is if this data disk here, whatever disk you have, if you made that a RAID array. Now, RAID arrays will normally be identified by a single drive letter, so this could actually be 3 or 4 disks, for example. And if I'm using something like RAID 0 and 4 disks, then I've quadrupled the performance of my paging file because it will be able to simultaneously read and write from all 4 of those disks at once, if I use a non-IDE RAID solution such as Serial ATA or SCSI. And of course, you just have to balance this out with whatever other things are going on with that drive. If I have a large database that I have users frequently accessing on that same partition, on that same RAID array, then I might not want to put the paging file there because it might interfere too much with the normal operation of that database. So you just have to balance this out and use some judgment in that sense. Now, if I do need to change any of this, I can customize the size here, giving it an initial size and a maximum size. If I fix the initial size here on a disk that is defragmented when I first create this, then what's going to happen is that at least that first 500 megabytes will always be contiguous and will never get fragmented. It could get fragmented when it goes from 501 megabytes up to 1,000, but you don't often see that in just general user applications. Whenever I run Photoshop and have lots of large files open and so forth, I can get into 1.5, almost 2 gigabytes worth of paging file size, though, so that would be an example of when you need to expand this. And then again, by default, it's just going to have a system-managed size. And if I change any of these settings, you don't just change it like I did just now and then click OK. You have to hit Set and then click OK in order for the changes to take effect. I can also choose no paging file size, no paging file at all. You have to make sure you have enough RAM to at least boot the operating system, however. Otherwise, you may not be able to boot. Now, why would I want to do that so that there was no paging file whatsoever? Well, if I was confident that I had a large amount of physical memory and I would never exceed that, that might be one instance in which I might consider that, but it's usually not advisable because Windows does a pretty good job of balancing between physical RAM and paging file size for purposes of performance. Also, by the way, another reason why you might want to choose no paging file would just be for temporary purposes. So for example, if I'm going to defragment my hard drive, then I might want to choose no paging file and then reboot the computer. Anytime you reduce the size of your paging file, by the way, you do have to restart the computer in order for it to take effect. So anyway, I said it's no paging file, restart the computer, get back into Windows and defragment the hard drive. Then it will have space to, when I come back into this, I can go back to either system managed size or custom size here. And then when I recreate the paging file now, it's going to go ahead and have contiguous space all throughout. Otherwise, that paging file could still be fragmented. I'm going to go to Disk Keeper here. I'm just going to analyze my drive D, actually, I guess is what I need to analyze. And it will show me how much space is used for the paging file on the volume map. And if I take a look at the file structure here, it shows me where my paging file is. So we see here, anything that's yellow is your paging file. So I've got a little bit here, I've got a little bit here, I've got a little bit here. This paging file is a little bit fragmented. It's probably not too bad, but if it starts to look like it's pretty well combed throughout this whole thing here, then I will probably need to defragment it. Now that's another advantage, by the way, of Disk Keeper, is that it will defragment the paging file, whereas the defragmenter that it comes with, Windows 2000, for example, does not do that, and it could leave the paging file fragmented even after it does a defragmentation run on the rest of your files. So to review our optimization tips for virtual memory, put it on a separate disk, your paging file on a separate disk, use RAID if it's available, or if you've got it. I wouldn't buy a whole RAID system just for the paging file, but if you've already got it and you can afford to use some space on it, go ahead and give it a shot. And then also, keep your eye on the fragmentation of the paging file. Once again, Disk Keeper can defragment the paging file. Otherwise, you might have to set it to 0 and then manually do a defragmentation run, and then set the paging file back to a reasonable size, and then restart the computer. And then we have temporary files. Now, what are these temporary files? These are something that the operating system or an application will create just for temporary purposes. It might be important to create that file, for example, in Microsoft Word. So if I'm working in Word and I'm there for half an hour typing away, and then I forget to save my data, and then the power goes out. Well, normally I would have lost all of that data. However, most versions of Microsoft Word will create an automatic background backup just in case something like that does happen, where the application either crashes or I have a power failure. And then what happens is, when the power comes back on and I turn on the computer again, Microsoft Word, when I start it up again, will identify that it has some temporary files left over from my previous session, and it will say, do you want to recover the data in these files? And I'll say, yes, thank you very much, because I forgot to save that file. And then it will recover all of the data up to the last time that it created an automatic backup. So that's just one example of how temporary files work. There are other applications that just need to do temporary files in order to perform their normal process. And this is because it's better to store data in a temporary file than to use space in RAM, because of course, if I use space in RAM that's not for critical information, then it's just going to slow my computer down and make less RAM available. So it just puts that temporary information in temporary files many times. Now, how do you identify and locate the temporary files? Well, you can do so in the System Properties, which I can right-click on my computer and choose Properties to access. And then, of course, I go to the Advanced tab. And then down here it says Environment Variables. And when I click on this, we see these temp locations, temp and TMP. The reason why it's identified both ways is because different applications call them one or the other. And notice that this data is stored in C:\documents and settings, trainer, and so forth. Let me show you by clicking on Edit something more specific about this. It really uses a variable, which is the %user profile variable, which says whatever the currently logged on user is, use their profile directory, and then it will go into the local settings and then temp. Now, what is it stored in local settings? And that's because if you use roaming profiles, as is often the case in a corporation where your profile is automatically copied up to a server somewhere at every log off, then when you go to another computer and you log on, not your normal computer, but maybe a neighbor's computer somewhere else in the office, then it will copy down your profile to that destination so you keep all your program settings and preferences. Well, temporary files are not normally considered to be an important part of the profile, so anything in the local settings directory does not get copied in that process. So that's why we put the temporary files there, and then of course the temp directory. And then it does the same thing for this one as well. Now, you can also identify where the temporary files are located by typing in the set command. And once I type in set, it does give you quite a bit of information. And if I scroll up to see it, I guess I don't have to scroll up because it's right there. It shows me again the location of those temporary files, and it's just using truncated file names there, but you get the idea of where those things are going to be located. So two different ways of identifying where the temporary files are. Now, here's the problem with temporary files. Number one, they can get to be quite huge. And I haven't even addressed Internet Explorer temporary files, by the way, which are probably the worst offender of all. But they can get to be quite huge in terms of the amount of storage space that they require. And by default, there's no automatic system to clean them all up. So you have to usually make a mental note sometime or put a reminder in your calendar to go scouring the system for leftover temporary files that you can safely delete in order to free up hard drive space. The other part of that, besides using hard drive space, is that they greatly contribute to fragmentation. Now then, let me show you in Internet Explorer how to locate where the temporary files are stored by going to Tools and then Internet Options. Then on the very first general page here, we see this temporary internet file section down here, and we can click on the settings to get more information about it. It's going to use about 2.3 gigabytes worth of data to store temporary files. So that's quite a lot of file space there. And you can see where it stores them in /documents and settings, trainer, local settings, and then temporary internet files. I can also view the files. Now, why is the purpose for the temporary files in Internet Explorer? It uses this as a caching mechanism, so that if I visit the same page twice, it doesn't have to retrieve all the data from that web page. Instead, it just retrieves it from out of my temporary internet files. For example, I got a lot of GIF files here, or GIF, depending on how you want to pronounce those. Some JPEG files. I don't even know what this is, but let me try one of these. Just double click on it and say yes. And what does it show me? Oh, it shows me, I don't know if you can even see that, it's pretty faint, but it's a graphical element from the ASUS web page. The reason why I have gone to ASUS is because that's the manufacturer of one of my motherboards. So anyway, all of this stuff is stored for me temporarily here in my temporary internet files. The problem is there's quite a few files there that get to be accumulated, so periodically it might be a good idea to go in here and then just simply choose delete files and then click OK. Rarely, if ever, do you have any information in those temporary internet files that is going to cause you a problem if you delete them. But regardless, when you do clean up the temporary files, especially for the Internet Explorer ones, you have to just do those manually. You may also want to go to your temp folder. Remember, I told you where the temporary files are located. I might just go in here. But regardless, when it comes time to clean up those temporary files, I'll normally have to just do that manually. And if I go back into my file system here, let's just identify where my documents and settings, trainer, and local settings, my temporary files are. That would be the temp files right in this location. Now, this could be from a number of different things. A lot of times, if you install an application, it needs to create temporary files during the installation process. A lot of times, that's what's left over in here. And so rarely, if ever, do I really need any of this. Now, I could go through all of this. I could just Control A and then hit the delete key on the keyboard. There might be some of these files that are currently in use, and if that's the case, it'll give you a stop message of some kind, rather not a stop message, but an error message telling you that it was not able to delete the file because it was currently in use. Now, the other way to work with this, then, to clean up your temporary files would be to use the Disk Cleanup utility found on the Start menu under All Programs and Accessories, and then System Tools, where we see Disk Cleanup right here. And once Disk Cleanup gets started, then it'll prompt you which drive you want to check for the Disk Cleanup process, and that takes a couple minutes sometimes if it's a lot of data to look through. I've already run this, so it parks me right here when it's done, and then I can see how many temporary internet files that I have to delete, all different types of temporary files that I can work with. And if it hasn't selected them for me, I can just manually select these items and then tell it that I want to delete them. So, for example, in this case, it'd delete about 20 megabytes worth of data just by deleting these temporary files here. So certainly, that's something that you could do if you want to help clean up the drive. Now let's go ahead and talk about services. Let me explain what these really are. They're a lot like a waiter. I remember my wife and I went to a French restaurant in Mexico one time. Can you believe that? Yes, a French restaurant in Mexico. But the service was excellent. We would sit at the table and enjoy our dinner, and the waiters, we actually had two waiters, they would just basically almost be staring at our table. so that if I would just nod my head in their direction, they would come running over to see what we wanted. My glass never got any more than 3/4 of the way full. I mean, if I just drank a quarter of a glass, they'd fill it up immediately. And besides that, they were dedicated to only our table. They would not wait on any other tables, so it was really, really something in terms of getting good service. But that's what happens a lot of times also with the services within Windows. Most of the time, they're mostly idle. They don't really do anything until the system kind of nods its head and says, hey, I need that service for something, and then the service kicks into action and does whatever it is that it's supposed to do. Now, because of this, I want to go ahead and get on a soapbox just for a moment. A lot of system tweakers out there on the internet, and in the A+ exam objectives, it kind of hints to this too. But it says that because each service requires a little bit of CPU time and a little bit of memory in order to be able to run and to be enabled and running, then it's going to slow down your system performance. I dare anybody to really show me a dramatic difference there. You can stop and you can really trim out all services you don't think are absolutely necessary, and I'll show you how to do that. And if you get rid of all the things you don't really think are necessary, I challenge you to scientifically prove to me that you can get a dramatic performance increase out of it. But that's just me. Nevertheless, the A+ objectives, we have to know how to stop and work with those services. Plus, if you stop certain services, it could later on cause problems. Let's say that a month ago, you stopped a service, and then now you try to run an application or perform a certain task, and it fails. Why? Because the service is stopped, but you're likely to have forgotten that you stopped that service, because after all, that was a month ago. There's been a lot that's happened since then. And then you'll go through all the common troubleshooting methods that we usually do to be able to try to figure out what went wrong, and it'll often take you down the wrong path because you totally forgot about this service that you stopped. Or maybe another technician has stopped a service. And again, this is a place where a lot of times we forget to look and to see if there's a service that's causing us a problem. By the way, in the event log, and we'll take a look at more of this in an upcoming nugget, in the event log, it can identify when certain things fail to start or fail to function properly because of a service problem. Now let's also take a look at some of these extra services. Number one, again, is there a performance benefit? I really don't think so, but that's going to be kind of subjective, I suppose. So the performance benefit is pretty questionable, but there's some other things to think about there in terms of security and malware. A user might have gone to a website that they inadvertently downloaded a malicious kind of an application that perhaps installed a service and started it. A lot of times, now remember, what's the service do? It just kind of hovers there waiting for something to happen. It could be waiting there for a trigger to happen. There might be some kind of a remote control server on the internet that at a certain point will try to touch that user's computer, and at that time the service will wake up and it will allow that remote control program from that malicious user on the internet to control the user's computer. So that's one kind of an example. The other thing is that certain kinds of malware or spyware can take advantage of services that you already have on your computer, but that are disabled by default, like the Messenger service is usually disabled by default in XP as a security measure. The Messenger service would respond to alerts, and it would respond to net send messages. So you could type net send space and then the name of a computer and then a specific message, and it would send a dialog box, a pop-up right in the middle of your screen. Well, we very frequently turn off the Messenger service because malicious parties on the internet and various kinds of programs out there on the internet can automatically scan entire subnets, for example, on cable modems, and send out a whole bunch of net send messages to the user. My next door neighbor, in fact, had that because they didn't have a firewall, which would have stopped those. And they had the Messenger service running on their computer, and every time they would try to use their computer, they would get hundreds of net send messages advertising all kinds of different things or malicious things or obscene things. A real big problem there with that service. Well, let's go ahead and take a look at those services. So how do I get there? Well, go to All Programs, Administrative Tools, and then go to Services. This is also available within the Computer Management Console, but I'll just go directly here to Services right now and expand this open. Now then, first of all, let me give you an example of a service that is started and that I want to be started. For example, the DHCP client right here. It's because of this that I can do an ipconfig all. Let me just type it in. And we've seen this before. And it's because of this service that's running that allows me to contact a DHCP server and to receive my IP address, which is right here. And that's what makes this computer DHCP enabled on this network adapter. Now, watch what happens. If this service, and I'll double click on it, was for some reason to be stopped. Someone didn't understand what it was, so they stopped it. They said DHCP, I don't even know what that is. I'm just going to stop it. And they no longer had it. Then what would happen is if I do an IP config all again, look what happens. I don't have an IP address. And in fact, I better get this started again right away because I need to use the network even to record my video. So I start this up again. Now once I've started it, ipconfig all, and it's gotten my IP address back again. So this is an example of a service that is necessary in order to be able to do normal networking in my case. There are other services that, again, I want to disable. For example, my messenger service. This is what would allow people to send messages to me that might be unwelcome. You can see that by default it's disabled. But if for some reason we decided that we needed that running all the time, and this is not one of the services normally that I want, I have seen it enabled on some networks where people like to send messages back and forth using that send, but it's a little bit of an antiquated method. Then they could go to automatic here, and then if I click apply, then I can now click on start, and now the messenger service will be running and somebody would be able to send me a message. An example of that is that from another computer, my computer by this name, I sent myself a message typing in net send trainer hello. I just typed all of that. I'll just type it in here, net send trainer hello. And that's what I typed in from another computer, sent it across the network to this computer, and it said hello, just like I said. So we can click OK here to clear that. Now I want to go ahead and stop this before some hacker takes advantage of my vulnerability here and starts sending me countless messages. Also make sure that you set this service to disabled and any other service that has security sensitivity instead of manual. Because if it's in manual mode, yeah, it might not be started, but there are certain external functions that could start it up, such as an application or an operating system function. Let me give an example of that with the CD burning service that we see right here. Notice that it's in manual mode and it's not yet started, but if I take a file, let's see this picture of my kids here. I think that's what that is, yeah. Then what if I wanted to burn that to CD for posterity's sake? Well, I'd right-click on this, choose Send To, and then send it to that CD. And then if I go into this Services and refresh the screen, we'll notice that it has now started because it has a need for that capability. And then if I go back into this folder where the file is getting ready to be written to the CD, and I change my mind and I say delete the temporary files, so that it's no longer going to be written to the CD. And if I don't have need for that anymore, then when I go back into the CD burning service again and again refresh the screen, now notice that it is no longer started. So you have to be careful of some of those that are set to manual mode as well. There could be an external function that will get them going. Now also I'm going to go outside of scope a little bit for A+ objectives and just give you some more information about services, and I'm going to use the DHCP client that we looked at earlier as an example. If we take a look at that, notice that it has a log on item. It says log on as local system account. This means that the operating system basically has an identity as the local system, and it will go ahead and perform the ability for this service to start. Otherwise, you might have to have an account. There are certain services that require a username and a password in terms of credentials in order to be able to start. Just be aware of that. We don't see that very often on an A+ level, though. That's usually going to be more of a server level function. Then there's also recovery. If this service fails, what do I do? Well, right now it says take no action, but you might also say restart the service just to make sure it gets going again, or run a program. Maybe if you have a service that has a problem, you want a program that sends messages to administrators to identify what went wrong, for example. Well, it might run some kind of a troubleshooting program or something, or restart the computer. That would be pretty drastic, but certainly you could do that if it was a critical application of some kind and you wanted to make sure that everything else was kind of reset back to zero. And then you can also set this up for second and subsequent failures. Then, of course, if it did choose to run a program, then it would make this item down here available, and you'd browse for and select the program that you wanted it to run. And then there are certain dependencies. For example, a DHCP service. It's not really much good without TCP/IP, is it? Because it really integrates well with TCP/IP. It's all part of the same thing. So a dependency is some other service or function that has to be running in order for this to be able to work. And that's not the case in our existing example, but there might also be other system components that depend on the DHCP client server properties to be running, and they would be listed down here. The reason why this is useful is because if you start the service and it still doesn't seem to be doing what it wants to, you can also check these other services that are listed, because perhaps one of those is also having a problem, and it's kind of causing a chain reaction of troubleshooting problems. Now here is something that could definitely be a performance issue, and that is certain startup functions. First of all, you have to identify what necessary applications are in your startup group. If you take a look at your start and then all programs and then startup, it'll identify things that load automatically. Normally, these are going to be things that an application that you've installed is going to place in the startup group for you automatically and usually without your knowledge. For example, the HP Digital Imaging Monitor and Zone Fast Start were installed when I installed that scanner and printer from a while back here when we did our printing section. So if these things are not stuff that I really care about or need, then I might not want them to be using up memory and potentially CPU utilization. If that's the case, I could right-click on one of those and just hit delete, and it would go away because these are just shortcuts, really. Again, you can use Task Manager if you want to identify how much requirements they are using in terms of something like the memory. Then we also have here the Adobe Reader Speed Launch. Well, I don't really care about that either, so I might delete that also. Now, those things appear in the startup folder, and they're pretty easy to identify, even for a lot of basic users. One thing you want to be careful of is sometimes users get overzealous if they start to get enough knowledge to be dangerous, and they go in there and they start deleting things that are supposed to be running, and that's causing them to not be able to perform certain actions on their system. So just keep those things in mind. Let me also point out that there's a portion of the registry known as the run key that can also launch these applications. A lot of them are really buried there instead because they don't want the users to be able to go to that startup location that I just showed you about right here and then start killing stuff in here. If that's the case, they might be a little bit more surreptitious and locate it inside of the registry. Now, if I go into my registry here, let me collapse a few things so I can make it a little bit more clearly to us. And I go into HQ Local Machine, Software, Microsoft, and then go down to Windows, current version. And then if I go down in here to Run, then you'll see certain things that will start, and you can just look at the location down here at the bottom if you need to make a better note of this. But that's where I go if I want to launch an application without making it plainly visible to the average user. A good example of that is I have antivirus software running here. That's Semantics Antivirus, indicated by this yellow shield down here in the feature tray area where my mouse pointer is hovering right now. Well, that's really started by this item. I don't want my users disabling their virus protection, so I make sure that that's always running there, for example. HP has a software update where it will periodically check on the internet to see if there's an updated set of files for my HP software or drivers. Well, if I don't want that, I could, of course, delete it from here. But you got to be really careful in here because there are certain things that you actually do want running, perhaps, and that if you delete them, once again, could cause a problem later on down the road. Now, let me show you. These things all apply to any user because why? They're located under HQ Local Machine. That means that all users, regardless of who you are, will load all of these things every time the computer starts up and somebody logs on. Now, let's go ahead and take a look at another location where you'll have this as well. If I go to HK Current User, Software, and then the path is mostly similar from this point, Microsoft, Windows, Current Version, and then again down here to Run, then we would see additional programs that would be running only tied to the specific currently logged on user. Now, I don't have anything there right now, but as you install applications and especially utilities and things like that, you'll see this start to get populated, and it might get populated with a bunch of junk that you don't really care about. Well, start getting rid of that stuff, see what happens, and see if it causes a problem. And if it doesn't cause a problem, chances are you can do away with it and save yourself some resources. In my view, it's much more efficient in terms of conserving resources to go through your startup and to get rid of anything there that might be superfluous rather than going through services and killing services. In this nugget, we talked about optimization, where we first of all use the task manager to identify things like the running processes, the CPU utilization, paging file utilization, which is also known as virtual memory. And it's with that we can change the size of it as necessary or otherwise manipulate it to get better performance, like, for example, putting it on a different drive. We also took a look at temporary files, which are supposed to be just that, temp files. They're not supposed to be around forever, and yet they often are unless you intervene and do something with those, so we took a look at that. And then we also looked at various services. Once again, the default services that start with Windows out of the box are normally pretty good. If you really want to, you can tweak those, however, and I'll show you how to do that. And then there's also issues with the startup. Remember, that can be in the startup folder on your start menu, or it could also be in a couple of places in the registry. Keep an eye on those things and make sure that they're not getting populated with things that you really don't care about and that could affect your system performance. Well, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.